At sunrise, the Colosseum stirred like a living beast, its arches catching the pale streaks of light while yesterday's blood still clung to the stone like an unshakable shadow. Beneath the stands, vendors called out to the few early arrivals, their baskets brimming with olives, bread, and watered wine, preparing for a crowd that had not yet filled the seats. Beyond the heavy iron gates, handlers struggled with half-starved predators, lions whose ribs jutted out beneath their hides, elephants stamping and trumpeting with rage, panthers pacing in cages and raking claws against the bars. From the dark tunnels below came the metallic clang of swords striking together, not the playful sound of practice, but the cold testing of steel meant for killing. And above it all, the low murmur of voices grew into a swelling roar as tens of thousands of Romans poured in, eager for the kind of spectacle their empire perfected better than anyone else, the art of turning death into entertainment. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. The arena was never just sport. It was a carefully engineered theater of cruelty, a laboratory where violence was tested and refined. Emperors staged naval battles by flooding the floor, starved wild animals to heighten suspense, and forced prisoners to reenact myths that ended in very real corpses. None of it was accidental. Every drop of blood spilled on the sand was part of a policy woven deep into Rome's machinery of control. Cheering from the stands was not harmless. It was loyalty shouted so loudly that it echoed through centuries. Today we step directly into that shadow to uncover the most brutal and inhumane acts that unfolded in the Roman arena, acts that went too far even for Rome itself. From funeral rites soaked in blood to executions disguised as theater, we will trace how an empire built glory by turning human suffering into applause. And before we dive deeper, make sure you hit subscribe so you do not miss our next descent into history's darkest corners. Now take your seat, because the gates are creaking open. The story of gladiatorial combat in Rome did not begin with emperors in royal purple or golden trumpets announcing the games. It began at a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva chose not to honor their father with statues or prayers, but with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and forced them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market thick with the stench of dung and smoke. This was not yet entertainment. It was obligation, a ritual known as munus, a duty owed to the dead. The tradition had roots that stretched far beyond Rome itself. In Campania, warriors were slain at graves to appease restless spirits. Over time, the killings shifted into structured combat. The dead no longer demanded random victims, but accepted chosen men clashing in battle. The Samnites, once fierce enemies of Rome, had held such contests often, and Roman elites embraced the custom eagerly. Burying a man with treasures showed wealth, but burying him with a blood-soaked spectacle displayed power that resonated through the crowd. What began as funerary duty soon grew larger. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's leaders realized that these fights could do far more than honor ancestors. They could stabilize politics and strengthen loyalty. Religious festivals that had once been solemn offerings to Jupiter began to feature gladiators. The Senate framed this shift as piety, but the crowd knew the deeper truth. These were state-sponsored acts of violence designed to keep people obedient. Even the armor of the gladiators told stories of conquest. Fighters dressed in the styles of defeated enemies, the Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with a curved blade, the Gaul with a broad sword. Watching them bleed was watching Rome's victories replayed again and again. every slash retelling the empire's triumphs. Death itself became propaganda. As blood flowed, the venues grew. Temporary wooden stands gave way to stone amphitheaters, temples of violence where thousands could gather at once. The games no longer belonged to grieving families but to the state, and each spectacle whispered the same message. Rome commanded armies, men, and even death itself. No one could have guessed how far it would go. What began as ritual sacrifice shifted into theater. Duty became obsession. Rome had discovered a new kind of power, the ability to control not just the living but the very meaning of dying. Once that door opened, it would never close. The crowd's roar was not reserved for men. Sometimes it thundered for beasts hauled from the farthest edges of the known world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes dragged across deserts. They were not displayed as wonders of nature but condemned as prey in a carnival of slaughter. Romans called these spectacles venations, hunts, but they were never about survival. They were about domination, proof that the empire could capture the wild and destroy it at will. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC when he paraded a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. Romans called it a camelopard, half camel, half leopard, because their language had no word for such a strange creature. It did not matter. The animal was not admired. It was thrown into the sand and torn apart, its death sending a message that if Rome could seize the strangest beasts alive, then Rome could conquer anything. The slaughter grew with each passing generation. When the Colosseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus reportedly oversaw the deaths of more than 9,000 animals in a single festival. Archaeologists have since discovered bones etched with the marks of deliberate starvation, evidence that lions and bears had been weakened before released to guarantee quick, bloody kills. Even elephants, once the terror of Roman legions under Hannibal, were herded into the arena and butchered for cheers. Behind the scenes, the logistics of these massacres became part of the theater. Exotic animals had to be trapped, hauled across deserts, and kept alive just long enough to meet their doom. Caravans dragged cages through scorching sands. Fleets floated them down the Nile. Handlers risked their own lives just to deliver these living trophies to Rome, and also they could be slaughtered on the sand for an audience hungry for fresh blood. Seeing a panther in the wild was dangerous enough, but watching one explode from a cage in front of 50,000 screaming spectators was power made visible. Every creature that died was a souvenir of conquest, proof that Rome's reach knew no limits. Some emperors made these hunts into their own stages of vanity. Commodus, Rome's most flamboyant showman, strutted into the arena dressed as Hercules, slaughtering hundreds of animals himself. He wanted to look like a god among beasts, but everyone could see the truth, a fragile ego hiding behind a bow. The hunts were often rigged. Animals were chained, maimed, or half-starved to ensure the emperor's victory, and the people cheered not out of admiration but out of fear. In Rome, silence could be fatal. Behind the cheers, a quieter tragedy unfolded. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder warned that rare species were vanishing from their homelands after decades of Roman slaughter. Lions, leopards, even elephants were pushed toward extinction to feed the empire's appetite for spectacle. The Colosseum was not only a theater of death, it was an ecological wrecking ball. But to Rome, extinction did not matter. What mattered was the illusion that nature itself could be trapped, starved, and destroyed for fun. Every carcass on the sand was another brick in the wall of imperial control. When most people today imagine a gladiator, they picture two evenly matched warriors locked in noble combat. But the reality was far more twisted. Rome thrived on imbalance, on contests engineered for cruelty rather than fairness. Organizers designed bizarre weapons, imposed absurd rules, and staged fights where no one had a real chance to win. Many of those thrown into the arena were not trained fighters at all but prisoners and condemned criminals. They were shoved into the sand dressed as clowns, armed with wooden swords, and forced to face seasoned killers. The crowd jeered as the doomed stumbled and fell, executions disguised as sport. Even the specialized weapons were created to keep the tension sharp and theatrical. The retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and trident, set against the secutor, whose smooth rounded helmet was shaped to deflect the net's weighted edges. It was not a test of pure skill but a staged riddle. Would the net ensnare its target, or would the sword break through before it could? The suspense of each exchange kept the crowd devouring every moment, even when the match was carefully staged to maximize spectacle. The numbers themselves grew obscene. Sometimes one gladiator was forced to face several foes at once. On other days, entire units were pitted against each other like miniature armies, turning the arena floor into a swamp of blood, splintered shields, and mangled bodies. And when novelty began to fade, Rome reached even further. Women were drawn into the spectacle. Female gladiators, known as gladiatrices, appeared on the sand during the 1st century AD. Writers like Juvenal mocked them with venom, but the records prove they fought against dwarfs, against beasts, and even against each other. Their very presence blurred gender roles but reinforced a harsher truth. No one, man or woman, was beyond Rome's hunger for spectacle. Even the helmets themselves became tools of torment. Some were designed to narrow vision or to muffle sound so that fighters stumbled half-blind while the audience roared with laughter. Others were so heavy that lifting one's head became a struggle in itself, turning armor from protection into punishment. Propaganda was also woven into these bloody plays. Gladiators were sometimes forced to dress as barbarians, mimicking Rome's defeated enemies. Their inevitable deaths reminded every spectator that the empire always prevailed. Every imbalance, every bizarre rule, every exotic twist was carefully calibrated to keep the crowd shocked, entertained, and obedient. The Colosseum never tolerated repetition, constantly invented new cruelties, always searching for the next thrill. By midday, once the morning duels had already soaked the sand in blood and the crowd's energy began to sag, the arena shifted gears. Combat gave way to theater, and death itself became the centerpiece. Romans called this damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. For the condemned, there was no trial left to fight, only a script that demanded their destruction. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, and prisoners of war all became unwilling actors in these bloody pageants. Each punishment was matched to the supposed crime. Thieves were torn apart by wolves, arsonists were burned alive, traitors were hurled to lions. Every scene became a morality play acted out with real human lives. The scale of these spectacles could defy belief. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations following his Dacian victories, thousands of captives were slaughtered over the course of 103 relentless days. This was not random carnage. It was methodically organized, paced like the acts of a grim drama. Every execution designed to hold the audience's attention until the next horror arrived. Animals became the stars of this nightmare. Lions were starved until frenzy before release. Bears were chained in pits and goaded into sudden fury. Even prized leopards were unleashed on trembling victims, their unpredictability keeping the crowd on edge. Would the beast strike instantly, or would it play with its prey before killing? That uncertainty was its own form of suspense, and the stands howled with bloodlust. Sometimes the cruelty came dressed in the borrowed robes of legend. Prisoners were forced to play the roles of doomed heroes. Orpheus was torn apart by wild beasts. Prometheus was chained as vultures circled overhead. These were not tales anymore but blood-soaked performances staged for laughter and applause. Death in Rome was rarely just death. It was theater, grotesque theater, where the condemned were expected not only to perish but to perform their own demise, acting out myths with their bodies as the final canvas. The empire's cruelty stretched further still. Crucifixion, borrowed from the East, was staged inside the arena for public amusement. Men and women were nailed to crosses while vendors sold snacks and children played nearby. Fire joined the spectacle too. Some prisoners were forced to wear the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch that was set ablaze, turning them into writhing human torches. Smoke curled into the sky as the condemned burned alive before the eyes of tens of thousands. Early Christian writer Tertullian described them bitterly as living torches, their agony transformed into entertainment. These killings were never simply about punishment. They were propaganda, warnings carved into flesh. To defy Rome meant to die slowly with an entire city watching. Not every Roman stomach could handle it. The philosopher Seneca confessed that watching midday executions hardened his soul, stripping away empathy instead of cleansing it. But his voice was drowned in the thunder of the mob, a crowd that demanded punishment not for justice but for thrill. Rome's imagination did not stop with sand and steel. Some emperors demanded oceans inside the city. Mock naval battles, known as naumachii, became spectacles on a scale so immense they bordered on insanity. Julius Caesar set the precedent in 46 BC, digging a vast basin near the Tiber, filling it with water and real warships. Thousands of captives were forced aboard and told to fight as rival fleets, not as actors but as men condemned to die. Arrows, catapults, and steel turned the water into a floating slaughterhouse. Augustus expanded the madness. In 2 BC, he created a basin almost 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, fed by a custom aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina, built just to keep it full. 30 warships clashed there, each crammed with prisoners fated never to leave alive. The message was unmistakable. Rome could summon seas where none existed, bending even nature to its will. By AD 52, Claudius went further, draining Lake Fucine to stage another naval battle. When the captives saluted him with the haunting words, "Those who are about to die salute you," history gained one of its most chilling lines. Whether it was rehearsed or a desperate cry, it captured the hopelessness of men turned into props. Fire, too, became a tool of myth and mockery. Victims wearing the pitch-soaked tunic were cast as tragic heroes consumed by flames. Hercules was reenacted writhing as poison and fire devoured him. Mucius Scaevola was forced to demonstrate his loyalty by holding his hand to the flames until the flesh blackened. The crowd roared with laughter while heroes screamed. Bravery was reduced to parody, their legends turned into mockery. Even the Colosseum's architecture became part of the cruelty. Under Titus and later Domitian, engineers constructed channels beneath the arena, allowing the sand to be flooded for smaller naval shows and drained again for combat the very next day. Cruelty became a feat of engineering. Water, fire, and flesh alike were turned into props for Rome's theater of control. Drowning captives, burning them alive, twisting cultural legends into humiliating scripts. All of it was designed to show that emperors did not just rule men. They pretended to rule the elements themselves. By the late 1st century, executions were no longer punishments in any traditional sense. They had become creative scripts dripping with malice, twisting culture and legend into acts of degradation. When the Colosseum was inaugurated in AD 80, the poet Martial recorded one such grotesque performance. An actor was forced to play Orpheus, the musician whose song tamed beasts. In myth, animals sat enchanted by his lyre. In the arena, a bear was released mid-performance and mauled him to death. Art became parody, beauty turned to butchery. Another victim was dressed as Daedalus, the inventor who fashioned wings of wax. Suspended on a crude contraption to mimic flight, he soared briefly before plunging into the beasts below. Marshall sneered that the man must have wished for real feathers, hiding his terror behind a poet's mask. Perhaps the most grotesque of all was the staging of Pasiphae's myth, the queen cursed to desire a bull. A show recreated her infamous union with a mechanical beast, followed by a killing that blurred execution, humiliation, and pornography. A warning about hubris was twisted into public degradation. These scenes made one truth clear. Rome owned its myths just as it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, and queens. None were safe from being rewritten as props in the pageant of death. For the audience, these ghastly plays were diversions between more serious contests. For the condemned, they were agonizing ends dressed in costumes. For the empire, they were propaganda made flesh, proving that Rome could even rewrite the meaning of its own legends. In the Colosseum, stories were not told with ink or marble. They were carved into skin, burned into bone, and applauded until silence swallowed the sand. As centuries passed, the appetite of the Roman people did not soften. If anything, it grew hungrier, demanding bigger games, stranger spectacles, and bloodier endings. The empire's leaders answered that demand with a steady escalation, using the Colosseum as both a theater and a weapon. Bread and circuses kept the masses distracted from poverty and politics. A free grain dole fed their bellies, and the arena fed their eyes. So long as the crowd was entertained, questions about corruption, inequality, and conquest could be drowned beneath the roar of approval. Yet the weight of cruelty never truly vanished. Whispers of unease circulated even in Rome's brightest days. Some citizens confessed that watching the condemned writhe under the teeth of lions left them sickened rather than satisfied. The philosopher Seneca admitted that after sitting through midday executions, he returned home feeling more vicious, less humane. He recognized that far from purging cruelty, the games instilled it. But such voices were drowned by the cheers of tens of thousands who wanted only more. The emperors themselves understood that cruelty was a political tool. Commodus, remembered as one of the most notorious of all, sought to blur the line between emperor and gladiator. He strode into the arena not as a patron but as a participant, fighting staged battles against wounded men and tethered beasts, victories guaranteed before he even lifted his sword. To him, it was not enough to be worshipped as a ruler. He demanded the adoration reserved for gladiators, those doomed celebrities who died for Rome's amusement. His reign demonstrated how the games could warp not only the people but also the emperors who fed their frenzy. Still, the games endured. For nearly 5 centuries, the Colosseum echoed with screams, roars, and the clash of steel. It became the beating heart of Rome, an institution as permanent as the Senate or the legions. To walk into the amphitheater was to step into Rome's power itself, power carved in stone, displayed in blood. It is easy today to imagine that it could have lasted forever, but history never allows cruelty to reign unchecked. Slowly, cracks began to form. Christianity, once a persecuted cult fed to the lions, began to spread through the empire. Its message, rooted in compassion and the sanctity of life, clashed violently with the culture of the arena. Where the crowd saw entertainment, Christians saw murder. Martyrs died in the sand, their blood nourishing a faith that refused to vanish. Over time, as emperors themselves converted, pressure mounted against the games. Constantine, after embracing Christianity, limited gladiatorial schools, though he did not abolish the spectacles entirely. The machinery of cruelty kept grinding, but its gears had begun to slow. By the 5th century, with the empire fractured and beset by invaders, the Colosseum's purpose began to crumble. Resources that once filled its cages with lions and bears were diverted to defending borders. Captives that once fed the endless hunger of the mob were no longer arriving in such numbers. The empire had new enemies and new priorities, and the endless festival of blood began to feel like a relic of another age. In 404 AD, after the monk Telemachus threw himself into the arena to stop a fight and was beaten to death by the crowd, Emperor Honorius finally banned gladiatorial combat. The Colosseum did not fall silent overnight, but its age of cruelty had come to an end. What lingered was the echo. The stones of the amphitheater, scarred by centuries of death, remained as a monument to Rome's insatiable hunger. Travelers in later centuries could not look at its towering arches without imagining the screams that once filled them. To this day, the Colosseum stands not only as an architectural wonder, but as a graveyard of forgotten names. Countless men and women whose blood was spilled to feed an empire's pride. The legacy of the games is complicated. Some point to them as evidence of Rome's mastery of engineering, organization, and pageantry. Others see only a warning of what happens when entertainment is purchased with human suffering. They remind us that cruelty, once normalized, can consume entire civilizations. Rome believed the games would last forever. They did not. The empire believed it could control cruelty without being destroyed by it. Could not. And yet, despite the horror, the fascination persists. Movies, novels, and television continue to resurrect the gladiator as a symbol of courage, endurance, and rebellion. The brutality is softened, polished into spectacle once again. We watch from the safety of screens and imagine ourselves in the sand, forgetting the smell of blood, the terror in the eyes of the condemned, the shrieks that echoed until throats were torn raw. Perhaps this is humanity's curse, to be drawn again and again to stories of blood. Or perhaps it is a warning, a reminder of how thin the line is between culture and cruelty. So the next time you picture the Colosseum, do not imagine a marble ruin bathed in soft sunlight. Imagine the sand soaked red, the animals pacing their cages, the condemned whispering their final prayers. Imagine the roar of 50,000 voices demanding another death. That was Rome, and that was its truth. If this story has shaken you, if it has opened your eyes to the shadows that history often hides, then make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Rome's legacy is a testament to human achievement, or a warning about how easily cruelty can be disguised as entertainment? Your voice keeps these stories alive, and your curiosity fuels the journey into the forgotten corners of history. Remember, history is never just about the past. It is about who we are today, about the choices we make when faced with power, spectacle, and cruelty. Rome believed its games would last forever. Instead, all that remains are ruins and echoes. What will remain of us?